Hey guys, welcome to Peripheral Vision, and today we're taking a look at the Retro Duo from Retrobit. The Retro Duo is what many people would call a clone console, and what a clone console is a piece of hardware built by third-party developers in order to play retro video games, in this case, NES and Super Nintendo games. Now, it was designed to be an inexpensive and efficient alternative to tracking down the older hardware. However, I've never really had good experience with them. But hey, let's give the Retro Duo the benefit of the doubt. On the front, we have two Super Nintendo controller ports. Unfortunately, even though you can play NES games on this, you do not have the option to input NES controllers, so things like the NES Zapper, the Power Glove, and stuff of that nature will not work, unless you have an adapter that goes from NES to Super Nintendo. On the sides, there are a series of vents, and on the back is where all your cords go. Now what's interesting about the cord that came with this is that it actually gives you the option of AV composite or S-video, so that's kind of a neat addition. And then we have a DC 5-volt power supply. Now, be warned, always make sure that you're using a 5-volt power supply. A lot of people think just because it will fit into the port, it works. Now, that's not true. If you have a voltage that is not 5-volt, it could potentially damage your system, so always be sure to use the voltage that is recommended on the side here. On the top, we have the two cartridge slots, Super Nintendo here and NES here, and then we have the power options. If you have this switch in the middle, it is off. Click it up for 8-bit and all the way down for 16-bit. The reset button, and two indicator lights telling you if it is on and if it is on 8-bit or 16-bit. Now these cartridge slots, there's some problems with them. Let's take an example card. Super Mario Bros. Now, when you put it in, there we go, fits fine. First problem, it is very wobbly. If you move this at all, it will wobble this and potentially disrupt your game. And when you're trying to take it out, it does not want to come. There we go. Okay, took a little bit, but it takes a lot of effort to pull this from the Retro Duo, and often it worries me that it will damage the card, so that's a big problem. Not only is it wobbly in there, but it's almost impossible to pull out. For the Super Nintendo cartridges, say for example Super Mario World, the problem is lessened. Not so much wiggle, and fairly easy to pull out. Now you are also able to use Super Famicom cartridges in the Retro Duo because it lacks the physical lockout. So take my Mega Man 7, or Rockman 7, and it will fit in there just fine. Now, Super Famicom carts take a little bit more effort than Super Nintendo carts in this case. Now, looking at the controller, what can I say? It's a cheap knockoff Super Nintendo controller. Obviously, the paint quality is fairly inferior because it's already starting to chip, and the feel and build is just lightweight and not very good. The buttons are clicky, and I like the clicky, but I don't know if the clicky is good or bad or not. But I would just suggest using a regular Super Nintendo controller with this thing. Now for the big question. Compatibility. You see, clone consoles often had issues playing games with special chips, or perhaps games that were unlicensed, but I'm happy to say that the Retro Duo does not have that many issues with compatibility. I would say roughly 95% of the Super Nintendo and NES's library can be played on this thing. Games like Super Mario RPG, Mega Man X, and F-Zero that would often give most clone consoles issues play perfectly fine. Now, of course, there are some exceptions here. Games like Earthbound and Terranigma, which have specific privacy settings, will be triggered with the Retro Duo, as well as games like Paperboy, which will not recognize the Super Nintendo controller at all. And of course, games that are light gun specific, which require NES ports, obviously, will not work. But I'm saying 95%, not too bad. For the most part, people that buy a Retro Duo are people that do not want to invest into a collecting habit. They just want to go and play their favorite old school games, the ones that you can find pretty much anywhere, and those games are all going to play on here. Now, if you're a collector specifically looking for something to save space, maybe you have a few games in your library that aren't going to work on this thing, but honestly, if you can find it for a cheap price, I'm going to say between $10 and $20 is where I'd be comfortable paying. It's not a bad piece as far as that goes, but the issues with the cartridge slots are a deal breaker for me. Honestly, I would go out of my way just to pick up a Super Nintendo or maybe a better clone console because I am too concerned with the risk of damaging your NES carts or potentially even your Super Nintendo carts. But you know what? That's your decision. If those things don't bother you, it does have a high rate of compatibility and it does work fairly well. So take that with a grain of salt, and as always, later days.